This iconic image has undoubtedly made its mark in literary history. Don Quixote was born over 400 years ago, translated into over 100 languages, and stands as the most prestigious and influential work in Spanish literary history. Legend has it that King Philip III of Spain once saw a young man standing on a balcony of the palace, laughing uncontrollably while reading a book. The king remarked, "He must be reading Don Quixote, or else he is mad." Sure enough, the young man was reading Don Quixote. The book describes a gentleman named Alonso Quijano, nearly 50 years old, living in a village in La Mancha, Spain. He has a housekeeper in her 40s and a niece not yet 20. They aren't wealthy like nobles but live comfortably. This gentleman, idle and at leisure, has only one hobby: reading chivalric romances. Over time, he becomes so obsessed that he loses his reason. His head is filled with magic, duels, battles, love, and suffering from the books. He believes only such a life is worth living, and all these stories are true. He deeply believes he can imitate the great knights in novels, so this gentleman takes them as role models and decides to become a knight-errant. The world is vast, and he must go to see it in person. He yearns for adventure, to fight injustice, and serve his country. He decides to take action, not just be lost in novels. His first step is to clean a set of armor that's been passed down in his family for years, left neglected in a corner, rusty and musty. He tries every way to polish it until it gleams, but he discovers a problem. The armor is incomplete. It lacks a visor to protect his entire face, only a skullcap without a vizard. What should he do? This gentleman ingeniously fills the gap. He manages to make a mask out of hard paper and attaches it to the skullcap, completing the helmet. When it's done, he needs to test it. Is it strong enough? Will it withstand a sword blow? So he takes a sword himself and strikes down, ruining his work of this week. This disappoints him greatly. Then he uses several iron sheets to reinforce it and makes a new face guard. He thinks it's strong enough in his mind, even if he doesn't dare strike it with the sword. As a knight-errant, he must have a horse. This gentleman has a skinny horse, a rather bad, lame horse. But he sees it as a once-in-a-lifetime horse, so he must give it a great name. It takes him 4 days to name his horse, which is awkwardly called Rocinante, meaning rare and uncommon. Now that his horse has a good name, he himself needs a good name. This gentleman thinks for 8 days and calls himself Don Quixote. Yes, that's where the name comes from. According to tradition, to show the origin of a hero has to add the place name of his hometown after his name, so our knight-errant's full name is Don Quixote de la Mancha, according to the tradition of that year. After doing all this, it's not over yet. One thing is crucial and is one of the core of the whole book. Let's see how Cervantes wrote. Saying, his armor was already cleaned up, the skullcap had been changed to a helmet, the horse had a name, and he had a name, but he felt it wasn't enough. Why? A knight should have a sweetheart. If a wandering knight doesn't have a lover, it's like a tree without leaves and fruit, and a shell without a soul. So, Don Quixote thought that knights often encounter giants. If I fight a giant or a dragon and cut it in half, I can make it my servant and command it to visit my lovely lady. I'll make it kneel before her, humbly saying, "Madam, I am the giant so-and-so, king of such and such island. The great knight Don Quixote defeated me in a duel and sent me to your service." Don Quixote envisioned this so vividly, naive yet charming. He believed his reputation should shine in the eyes of his beloved. But in reality, he's just an old man nearing 50. Where would he find a sweetheart? So he thought of a village woman nearby named Aldonza. Don Quixote decided to give his beloved a fancier name, Dulcinea del Toboso, quite a mouthful. Ironically, this woman, now named Dulcinea by Don Quixote, had no idea she'd become someone's love interest. She didn't even know him. Nevertheless, Don Quixote thought, no problem, everything's ready. So one scorching July morning, without telling anyone, our knight quietly left through the back door and embarked on his adventure. But just as he reached the outskirts, he realized a crucial oversight that almost ruined his venture. What was it? He suddenly remembered he hadn't been knighted yet. According to knightly rules, he couldn't duel with anyone without that title. This troubled him deeply. What to do? Don Quixote decided, if he meets someone on the road, he will ask them to knight him, and sure enough, opportunity knocked. After a day's journey, exhausted and famished, he arrived at an inn. To Don Quixote's eyes, everything resembled the knightly tales. The inn was like a castle, the weary woman at the door, a noble lady, and the innkeeper, a castle master. He was fully in character now, imagining many scenes, but to the inn staff, Don Quixote looked absurd. Dressed oddly and talking wildly, they just laughed aloud and no one took him seriously. Did this affect Don Quixote? Not at all. He was lost in his fantasies, determined to become a true knight soon. So, he told the innkeeper, "Tomorrow, you'll knight me." Don Quixote strictly followed the rule. A knight-elect must spend the night awake, guarding his armor and praying. And that's exactly what he did. Next to the inn was a courtyard where he kept his armor. Piece by piece, he laid it out near the well, shield on his arm, spear in hand, strutting proudly around the armor, as darkness fell and the spectators dispersed. Don Quixote remained steadfast, eyes fixed on his armor. It was a sacred moment for him. Just then, a mule skinner from the inn wanted to fetch water from the well to feed his group of mules. He moved Don Quixote's armor piled by the trough. The knight rushed over, shouting, "Hey, careless fellow, this armor belongs to the bravest knight with a sword. You want to touch his armor? Whoever you are, watch out and don't mess around, or prepare to pay with your life." He felt the dignity of a knight, but the unlucky mule skinner ignored him. Thinking he was just a madman, then grabbed the armor and tossed it far away. What could the knight do? A knight had to act according to tradition. Don Quixote looked up as if speaking to his beloved Dulcinea. Then said, "My lady, my heart devoted to you is insulted for the first time. I beg you for rescue. This is my first urgent moment. Please don't hesitate to bless me." After his prayer, he raised his lance and struck the mule skinner's head, causing serious injury. Other mule skinners saw their companion hurt and started picking up stones, hurling them at Don Quixote. He immediately felt like he was a true challenged knight, which only boosted his courage. Even if all the mule skinners in the world came at him, he was determined not to retreat, but his main duty was to guard the armor. Unable to rush into the fight, he raised his shield to block the stones and beat and shouted amidst the chaos. The innkeeper heard the commotion and rushed over, persuading everyone to disperse. He said, "Look, this man is clearly mad. Why bother with him?" To calm Don Quixote's frenzy, the innkeeper decided to knight him right away and send him on his way quickly. How did the ceremony go? The innkeeper handed Don Quixote a ledger, called over a young boy with a candle, and brought 2 girls from the inn. He instructed Don Quixote to kneel down. The innkeeper read from the ledger with solemn words. Then, he raised his hand and slapped Don Quixote on the neck. Then with his sword, gave a hard pat on his shoulder. One of the girls stepped forward to hang the sword, wishing the knight success in all his battles. Don Quixote was deeply moved. He felt the ceremony completed his transformation. He asked the girl about her name, saying he would one day serve her. The girl didn't want to talk to him at all. The absurd ceremony ended hastily, but Don Quixote thought he was already a knight now. Delighted, he didn't wait for dawn, eagerly riding off on his adventure, believing he had a great future ahead. The next day, Don Quixote arrived at a crossroad and immediately thought of the novels where knights-errant chose their paths, following the book's example. He loosened the reins and let his horse decide for itself. How did the horse feel about this? Not far from its home, the skinny horse remembered exactly where its stable was, so it made up its mind to gallop towards the village. After a few kilometers, he suddenly saw a group of merchants approaching. Don Quixote believed he was encountering a marvelous adventure. Just like in the book, he sat up proudly in the saddle. Gripping his lance firmly and shielding his chest with his shield, he stood in the middle of the road, held back his horse, and awaited the approaching group. When they got close enough to exchange greetings, Don Quixote raised his voice proudly and said, "All of you must acknowledge the peerless beauty in the world. None can bear comparison with the lady of my heart in La Mancha, the unique Dulcinea del Toboso." Who was that? Exactly that village maiden, but Don Quixote had already renamed her in his mind, considering her his ideal lady. So, he declared to everyone that she was of utmost importance, warning them not to pass without acknowledging her.